Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. For those of you who are new here, my name is Miranda and I am the Enchantress of Avalon. So for today's video, since it is getting posted the day before Valentine's Day, I thought an appropriate topic would be discussing some of the lovers of the Greek goddess Aphrodite. Now, I did discuss some of her love affairs in my previous video about her, but there are just so many and it's a fun topic no matter whether it's been discussed before or not, and it has by many people. So I am going to start with briefly mentioning her two most famous love affairs, but I did cover them a little bit more in depth in my previous video. And those are the love affairs with Ares and with Adonis. Ares was her most notable divine lover, the god of war. So, of course, love and war uniting in an affair to remember is pretty classic. And I told the story of Hephaestus, who was Aphrodite's actual husband. She was forced to marry him. Learning from Helios that Aphrodite and Ares were having an affair and constructing this plot to capture the lovers together because he wanted people to be irate at the fact that she had betrayed him, where really every other Olympian just kind of thought it was funny until Poseidon convinced Hephaestus to let the lovers go free, cut them down. And that, of course, ended the union of Aphrodite and Hephaestus. I will briefly note that in conjunction with that tale, I never mentioned this part, but since Poseidon was the one who convinced Hephaestus that it was a good idea to let them go instead of just letting them hang up from the ceiling in this net for whoever knows how long he was going to leave them up there, it is theorized, and some myths do allude to Aphrodite having had a brief affair with Poseidon in gratitude for him doing this, because her and Ares were in an off period after all of that went down. Not to say that they stayed away from each other for very long, ever, because they didn't. They were the really most famous on and off again relationship in Greco-Roman mythology. And they had several children together, including the god of love, Eros, at least in some variations. He's also a primordial deity who is separate from being the son of Aphrodite, predating her in many ways. But there's some confusion over whether there was two Eroses, one being the primordial deity, one being the son of Aphrodite, or if they were actually one and the same and eventually merged. And we know him today as Eros, or his Roman equivalent that is so prevalent this time of year, Cupid. And for Adonis was the lover of Aphrodite, who was her most famous human lover. He was a young man who was born after an incestuous union between a beautiful young woman named Mira and her father that Aphrodite sort of orchestrated. Mira's parents kept comparing her to Aphrodite and saying she was more lovely than the goddess of beauty. You don't do this. You don't compare yourself to a goddess or a god. It is highly insulting. And it led to Aphrodite cursing Mira to lust after her own father. And then when her father tried to murder her, all of the gods got together and turned her into a tree which ended up becoming sacred to Aphrodite, the myrrh tree. Myrrh is sacred to Aphrodite. And months later, a baby was born from the tree. She had given birth to her son, Adonis. And Aphrodite, wanting to protect the babe from his grandfather/father, gave him to Persephone to care for. And then, of course, it ended up being that when he grew into a fully formed man and Aphrodite saw him again, she obviously was attracted to him, but Persephone didn't want to give him up because she was also beguiled by his beauty. And they started arguing over him. So similar to Persephone's own situation with her husband Hades, Zeus steps in and says, okay, listen, Adonis is going to spend a third of the year with Persephone, a third of the year with Aphrodite. The final third of the year, I'm letting you decide for yourself. And of course, he chose to spend that time with Aphrodite because he was in love with her. And they were this epic whirlwind love affair that ended very tragically when he was killed, usually gored to death by a boar. And there are many different versions of how he came to be killed, and many different people that were the culprit. But most commonly, it's said to have been Ares himself, in jealousy over the fact that Aphrodite was paying so much attention to this mortal Adonis that he couldn't keep his anger in check and either use some sort of mind control to get this boar to kill him, or he turned into the boar and mauled him to death himself. There are other versions that I believe link Artemis with it, and over competition with hunting, because Adonis was supposed to also be this really amazing hunter, and she was jealous over his hunting prowess. But it's usually the Ares situation, because this is a love myth, so jealousy over love and crimes of passion go hand in hand, don't they now? Now, moving on, because I didn't really cover all of the Ares and Adonis connection there in my last video, I'm going to move on to the other lovers. So, I am going to briefly touch upon the story of Aphrodite and Hermes and the story of Aphrodite and Anchises. So, it's another divine lover and another mortal lover. So, Aphrodite and the Greek god Hermes actually did have an affair in Greek mythology, and it's one of my favorite affairs because I feel like they were probably the most well-suited love match out of all of her love matches, because Ares was just too much of an angry torrent, and her other love matches that would have been good, like Adonis, he was mortal and he never really stood a chance to really stay around. But Aphrodite and Hermes had a similar temperament of excitability and exploration and having this very fun-loving nature, because Hermes is a trickster god, as well as being the god of travel and commerce and the god of messengers, like he's a messenger to the gods. He is also associated with being a trickster. From his moment of birth, he's been a trickster. He literally, as an infant, because he's one of the gods that wasn't born fully formed, but born as a baby first and then grew up very quickly. He, from the moment of his birth, was a trickster. He literally escaped his crib and went out on a little adventure. He invented the lyre, and then he stole a bunch of cattle from Apollo, his older brother. And Zeus thought this was hilarious when he found out about this. So he basically didn't really reprimand Hermes very much. And in fact, because of Hermes' abilities, even as such a young babe, he began to trust him very quickly. And Hermes made it up to his brother Apollo by saying, okay, yeah, sorry, I stole your cattle, but here's this instrument I invented. It's called a lyre, and that's why the lyre is sacred to Apollo. It was actually invented by Hermes, though. So you have these fun-loving figures coming together, and neither is very jealous of the fact that, oh, your attention may stray, because because Hermes, of course, his attention would stray, and he was known to have a lot of lovers in Greek myth. And of course, so would Aphrodite. She was the goddess of love and beauty. But they balanced each other well, and they had an understanding of one another. And from their union, they did have a son, it's an androgynous god named Hermaphroditos, and yes, that's where the word hermaphrodite comes from. And it's just this perfect amalgamation of the fact that they are these free-spirited, very creative, very artistic sort of gods, and they balance each other so well. They're just kind of a good fit. They're puzzle pieces that fit together really well. But the relationship doesn't get as much attention as her other relationships, so I did want to pinpoint it a little bit on this video. And then the final relationship I want to discuss, I did mention it very briefly in my last video because I talked about Aeneas, who was one of Aphrodite's sons. He was a demigod and a hero. And that's when she pulled out of the Trojan War when he was going to be killed. She could not see her child die, so she saved him and pulled out of the Trojan War and decided to be the protective mother instead, which, good move on her part. Well, he was born from a union between Aphrodite and a mortal man named Anchises. And this story started because the gods of Mount Olympus were getting a bit annoyed at Aphrodite for meddling in their love affairs. But I have to just note, how could you be annoyed at the goddess of love for meddling in love affairs? It's literally what she's supposed to do. But they thought she was meddling too much in their love affairs and the love affairs of mortals. So Zeus put a little curse on her to make her lust after this mortal man as a punishment. So she knew what it would feel like to be lusting after a mortal. And that was a man named Anchises. And Aphrodite pretends to be a mortal woman, and I believe a virgin at that, when she meets him. And then she beds him. And the next morning, she reveals the truth to him, and he's horrified at the fact that he's just bedded a goddess, let alone the goddess of love and beauty herself, because he thinks, like, I'm not worthy, and he's just so terrified of the repercussions that could come from having bedded a goddess. But she assures him that he will be fine, and she is going to be bearing him a son. As a goddess, she knows when she's pregnant, like, immediately. So yeah, she did bear him a son, and that son is Aeneas, who is a famous hero of mythology. So I do hope that you've enjoyed this very romantic and sexy Valentine's Day video about the lovers of the Greek goddess Aphrodite. If you have liked it, please like, comment, subscribe, and check out my blog, whiteroseofAvalon.life, for more content. I have so many blog posts about Aphrodite on there. I will link some in the description box down below. Have a very happy Valentine's Day, everyone.